What's up, guys? Welcome back to Core CSS Mastery. We're going to be talking about fonts. Now, we have spoken quite a bit about styling text. This is going to be something slightly different and involves the idea of using different typefaces or different fonts on our web page. Let's start off by recapping on the font family property. Now, previously, we just provided a single value for the font family property, and it was a generic family name such as sans serif. You can see in this case, we actually have 4 values. It's a list of different fonts separated by commas, and this provides the browser with fallback options. So the browser starts at the left, where we usually have our preferred font. So in this case, Helvetica. Now, if Helvetica is available, the browser is going to load that up on the page. If it's not available, then the browser is going to use the next option in the list, which is Trebuchet MS. Now, you might wonder, why is Trebuchet MS in double quotes, but Helvetica is not? It's simply because Trebuchet MS has a space in the font name. We could also just put Helvetica in double quotes if we really wanted to. It won't make a difference in this case. So if Helvetica wasn't there on this list, then the first font is naturally going to be Trebuchet MS. So if you refresh the page, you can see we get a slightly different font for our paragraphs. Now, it might be tempting to try and use any font that we have available on our system, but there's a problem. We could find that we have a font on our system and the web page looks great, but when someone else loads the web page, perhaps they don't have that font enabled on their system, and the browser's not going to be able to load that font. Now, this is one reason why we choose fallback options. So let's say someone didn't have the first available option. We can provide a fallback option that looks similar. But in many cases, we actually want better control than this. We want to ensure that a visitor is seeing our website's font exactly as we're seeing it. After all, sometimes font or typeface is tied in with very specific branding requirements, and it's a branding problem if our text is not showing up the way it should. So how can we ensure that a visitor is seeing the exact font we want them to? One way is by making use of a web-safe font. The idea behind a web-safe font is it's typically available for everyone. So you can see a list there, and on this page we can see some samples, for example, Arial and how it looks, Verdana, Helvetica, Tahoma, Trebuchet MS. And this is great. So if we're not too fussy about the font, we can perhaps choose one of the fonts that's considered a web-safe font, and it's going to be available on 99.9% of systems. However, what if we want some type of custom font? And there's a very high chance that font is not going to be available on a visitor's system. Well, the next option in that case is to actually bundle the font with our web page. Google Fonts is one example of a place where we can browse and download fonts. So for example, let's check out this VICWANT beginner. And notice that there are different individual styles associated with this font. So there's different weightings. Remember, as part of the font weight property, we can actually provide a value, and it's usually a number that's a multiple of 100, between 100 and 900. And we mentioned that the availability of different boldness settings is really dependent on the font itself. So you can see, for example, that this particular font or font family, which is a collection of different styles, there are actually 4 available fonts with 4 different weightings. So we have 400, 500, 600, and 700. Now there's a few ways of grabbing these fonts. The first is to actually host the font ourselves and store it on our server. So for now we're going to download. So we'll choose the option download family. So we're offered a zip file, which we'll grab for now. And we'll just extract the contents of this .zip archive we've been given here. And we'll inspect the contents together. Now we have a few different files in here. First of all, we have a TTF file, which is going to be the font itself. We then have an OFL.txt, and we have a readme.txt. So let's take these one at a time. What is .ttf? Checking the W3 docs, we can see that they are different formats of font, and they're listed here in order of newness. So the original is the TrueType font, which is .ttf. That's what we have. It says developed in the late 1980s by Apple and Microsoft. Then we have Open Type Fonts, OTF, Web Open Font Format, and Web Open Font Format version 2.0. So in future, if we see something that has .otf or .ttf or .woff, Well, we know that it's very likely a font file. So it's this file we'll take and we'll place it on our server in a location that it can be accessed. Next, we have ofl.txt. So this is a text file detailing the license associated with this font. Now, this is open font license. It basically means we can use the font, we can distribute the font, we can use it as part of an application, such as a web application. The only thing we can't do with the open font license is sell a font directly to someone. Not all fonts are free to use. Some of them you need permission, you need to purchase the font before you are legally allowed to use it as part of your web page. It only takes a quick Google search to find numerous examples of people actually being sued for using fonts that they didn't have permission for. And some of these cases go into the millions of dollars. There's an example there about Haribo. They only had desktop use rights for a font they chose to use on their packaging. So they had rights to the font, but only in certain contexts. And when they used the font outside of that specific agreed upon context in the license, well, they found themselves facing a lawsuit. Now we have a README, which may or may not be included, but there's some additional information in here that might be useful. For example, the README file here mentions that this is a variable font. The idea with variable fonts is that we only need one font file to achieve all of these different styles. Whereas if a font is not a variable font, we might need a different font file for the 400 weighting, a separate font file for the 500 weighting. So as we can imagine, a variable font takes up less space because it's a single font that's downloaded and then can be used to achieve various different styles. Now I've taken that .ttf file because we realize it's the font file. I've renamed it to something that's a little bit easier to handle. I've just called it myfont.ttf. We'll now make a use of a CSS @ rule to import that font. So we want the @fontface @ rule. We're going to set font family to a custom name. So in this case, let's call it my custom font. Then we're going to provide the location of that font file. So we'll use a source property, and I'm going to pass in the CSS URL function to indicate the location of that font file. Now in this case, the HTML document we're using is in the same folder as the font. So we can simply type myfont.ttf, and that's our complete CSS rule for importing the font. Now the font's not being used yet, so we won't see any changes to the page just yet. Let's change our default font to my custom font. Let's save that. Let's refresh the page. Now it's actually using one of the fallback fonts because we need our colon here. Let's try that one more time. Once again, it doesn't matter too much whether we use inverted commas around my custom font. The key idea here is that we assign the name in font family when creating using the @fontface CSS @ rule. Then in font family, we pass the same value. So it doesn't have to be called my custom font, it can be called whatever we want it to be. Rather than my custom font, we would probably just call it the name of the actual font itself. Now we might remember that this font came with 4 default styles included as part of that variable font setup. And we can manipulate 4 different font weights. So we have 400, 500, 600, and 700. So let's try 400. That appears to be what we have by default. So let's try 500, and we should notice the font weight gets slightly darker here. And we also have 600 and 700. So the idea is you could use these different font weightings for different aspects of the page. So if something is a heading, it probably wants a higher font weight. If something is just plain text or ancillary notes to a document, we could maybe use the lighter typeface. So this is how to host our own font file on our server. What if we wanted to import the font file from a remote location? Google Fonts allows us to do that also. This is a second font family. It's named Cormorant SC. It's also open font license, so we can use it freely. Notice that we have the option to select different styles from within this font family. So we could decide, we can pick and choose which of these we want and which of them we don't. So we've got light 300, regular 400, medium 500, semi-bold 600, and bold 700. Let's just say, for example's sake, that we wanted them all. So let's click the plus icon on all of them. And notice over on the right-hand side, we have a Use on the Web section. This is probably the absolute easiest way to make use of a custom web font and be assured that it's also going to load up exactly the same when any visitors come to our site. Now we have two different ways of pulling in these custom fonts. The first is to use a link to a custom generated style sheet, and it's been generated on the Google servers. And all we need to do is copy this HTML. So we'll just paste those link tags in there. Remember from earlier in the course, if we are making use of an external style sheet, we also use something similar. We have link href, and the rel attribute is set to style sheet. And what we can see is it's just importing the specific font weights that we've asked for. Now in this case, it's all of them, but if we just requested 300 or 400, then we wouldn't see the 500, 600, and 700 here. And the advantage for us is if we're only going to make use of 2 of the different font styles, it means less download for our visitor. So we're now going to delete my custom font. And instead, we're going to use Cormorant. So let's refresh our page, see what we get. Okay, that hasn't quite worked. Let's fix the typo in the font. So it's Cormorant. And also let's get the technically correct name of the font, which is actually Cormorant SC. If we get the name 100% correct, then you can see the font's going to load up. Now just to test the weights, we had access to different weights according to Google Fonts. So let's try some of them out. Font weight 400. So you can see it's generally quite a light looking font, and 700 was actually the darkest version of this font that we received, which looks like this. Returning to our Google Fonts page, we can also make use of @import. So @import allows us to import an external style sheet, and there's really not a big difference between using link tags and @import. The only difference is that link tag is basically HTML, whereas @import is a CSS @rule, but it's going to be achieving the same thing in this case, which is it's importing an external style sheet. And what is that external style sheet doing? Well, it's setting the font with the @fontface CSS @rule. So back with our HTML, I've removed the previous link tags from the HTML. We still have our font family set to Cormorant SC, but now the browser is falling back to the Verdana font because it can't find this Cormorant SC. So we pasted in this import statement. Let's save the HTML document. Let's reload the page. And once again, we can see the Cormorant SC font being loaded up. So as a very quick recap, here are our 4 options. Option number 1, use a web-safe font. Option number 2, download and host our own font file, then link to it using the CSS @rule @fontface. But by far the easiest option, in my opinion, is either 3 or 4, where we find the appropriate font on a service like Google Fonts, and we saw that Google Fonts automatically generates the appropriate link tag or the appropriate @import tag if we prefer. All we need to do is import that external style sheet from Google Fonts, and we can then make use of the corresponding font family when styling a section of text. All right, thanks very much for watching, guys. Hopefully you're very comfortable with using custom web fonts after this lesson. Catch you in the next part of the course.